I'm going to speak about the findings from not only a project that I ran in 2022, which was specifically with fathers experiencing family breakdown and separation, but I'm also going to speak about kind of my findings in this area more widely because I have subsequently done quite a lot of research with both mothers and fathers that have gone through the family court process, as well as some autoethnographic work on my own experiences as a child in that process, and work with my dad who is a father as well. And so whilst I'm going to be talking about the report and some of the gendered phenomenon that we see and the experiences, there are actually quite a number of areas of overlap with those who engage in the family court system and how they equally kind of struggle with similar issues. Um, and I actually recorded a TEDx talk on this on the Friday just gone, which I will share in due course. Um, so in terms of the project that I ran in 2022, um, I did a multi-method, multi-study project that was looking at men's experiences of family breakdown, separation and divorce, where we did a quantitative review of over 1,000 case files of men seeking help for family breakdown, both from a legal perspective but a mental health perspective with a charity in Kent. We did a qualitative two-part study, which was with 130 fathers who took a survey, and then 30 fathers who did a follow-up interview. And then we also did what's called a deliberative inquiry with 6 organisations that support men in this space, which is essentially like a focus group, but it's much more collaborative and discussion based around how we can then get to solutions. And we found a number of things across those 3 studies. In the first study, we found that out of the men seeking help, we got some top line figures out of that, which were really quite disturbing. We had a high prevalence around between 40 and 45% of involvement in family court proceedings. So a really high number of men who are going through separation are involved in some kind of court proceeding. And around a similar figure said that they had experienced domestic violence either within their relationship or post-separation. Around 20% were engaging in some kind of had substance use or misuse issues. And most alarmingly, around 40% of their 1,000 sample said that they'd experienced suicidal thoughts in the last 12 months when they took their intake survey, which, as I've noted in a few presentations, if you extrapolate that figure to the amount of men who are experiencing divorce in the UK every year, that's around 11,000 men as a conservative estimate that are actively suicidal every year in the UK because of their experience of family breakdown. So then in study 2, we did a deeper dive onto kind of what the experiences of men were with the qualitative interviews and survey. And we found 5 kind of major themes that really kind of tracked their experiences chronologically. So we spoke about the experience of family breakdown itself, and we found that, unsurprisingly, this happened for a number of reasons. We know that relationships are complex, as the humans are that make them up. But we also found that many of the kind of roots of those issues were occurring early on in terms of a poor amount of support pre and postnatally, which I thought was quite an interesting finding. And that they experienced, as anyone really who's involved in family breakdown does, negative emotions, sadness, shame, fear, etc. So that was the kind of least surprising theme. The second was around the abuse that men were experiencing, and around half of them reported abuse within their relationship, whilst it was intact. But almost all of the sample reported that since the relationship had broken down, they were then experiencing some form of post-separation abuse, with around a third of the sample talking specifically about alienating behaviors, targeting the relationship between them and their child, but a whole wide variety of abusive behavior, characterizing post-separation experiences for men. And that kind of led on to where those behaviors most likely occurred. And a lot of it was centered around negotiation of shared parenting or shared responsibility and shared care, custody, etc., and contact. And there were a few two, maybe three men out of the 130 that said that they were able to have done that in a positive way, and been able to have those conversations without involving any kind of support system. But the overwhelming majority of men spoke about having a negative experience of trying to negotiate a co-parenting plan, and that they were desperate to stay out of court, but often felt that they had no choice to go to court because there was no framework in which most couples were kind of operating around. And overwhelmingly, it was men that were losing the contact, and moving out the family home, etc. When they spoke about court specifically, overwhelmingly, unanimously, uniformly negative experiences, traumatizing, re-traumatizing, um, financially decimating, emotionally decimating, biased. They said it was very biased in favor of mothers, didn't feel that their experiences and their claims were taken seriously, were viewed as second-rate citizens and parents, etc. Um, Interestingly, I would just interject there that those findings are mirrored in the work that I've done with mothers and fathers, in that actually the overwhelming message is that nobody has a good or positive experience in family court. And I think that's something that we're all fairly familiar with. So it's certainly not a gendered phenomenon to have a bad time, but there were some interesting gendered notes around, for example, how fathers were viewed within the family courts, how seriously their claims were taken, and the arrangements that they ended up with, etc., as well as things like access to legal aid, which many men reported they felt that it was easier for potentially women to get access to than for men, although that needs a bit more exploration. So then we talked about, in terms of kind of coping, and what the impact of that was. Um, and the fourth theme was really around this kind of impact on physical and mental health on the fathers. Many fathers reported, as was, mirroring the stats, really, really profound negative mental health issues covering a wide variety of domains, including suicide ideation. And two of the fathers that, when we interviewed them, they were actively in that space, which was obviously very difficult to manage. And they were also stuck in this position where they felt they had no other options. They wanted to commit suicide, but actually the only thing keeping them alive was the thought of their children, but those were children that they didn't have access to. So it was this kind of limbo, kind of paralysis in the middle. And the physical health as well. Men reported that the toll of the proceedings, and especially with family court, was resulting in everything from just increased stress and increased blood pressure to autoimmune disease induced by stress, including autoimmune-based blindness. They also reported, obviously we couldn't speak to the children themselves, but they also reported a profound effect on children as well, and the stresses of the breakdown and the abuse on them. And they also felt despair, knowing that they were potentially barred from, helping and protecting their children from a partner that they viewed to be actively abusive towards them and the children. And finally, in terms of coping and services, men coped in sometimes quote unquote healthy and sometimes quote unquote unhealthy ways. So some did gravitate towards meditation and exercise, but many gravitated towards overeating, overworking, and substance use and misuse. And in terms of the services, men spoke actually very warmly about their friends and family, and said that actually friends and family had played a really supportive role, which is a slight break from the literature that we see when we look at men purely as victims of domestic violence, where they report that actually sometimes those reactions can be quite negative. But they did report that whilst there were pockets of support around, overwhelmingly there was very little support there for them. And then we moved on to study 3, which was around the service providers. It was with the service providers themselves. So we had 6 organizations that work with men in this space, echoing a lot of those themes, what the challenges were, what the barriers were. Most of those were around resourcing, funding, the fact that demand was outstripping supply by a huge factor, but also the challenges that they felt in operating in a space where they were advocating for people who aren't necessarily acknowledged, or empathized with by society, and the challenges with that, and having to frame their services around children in order to help men because helping men wasn't enough. So we got a kind of picture from those three studies that, you know, we have a latent kind of public health crisis in relation to separated men. There are a huge amount of them, but they're hugely invisibilized and they're hugely at risk. And we need to act very swiftly to do something, do many things about that, including, as the report sets out and the copy is available online, is around providing more support, what I like to call family breakdown triage, to do that early on so that couples are given the support that they need earlier on in the processes. And we need to make sure that that support covers a wide variety of forms, so community support, digital support, app-based support, but also that that support is inclusive and kind of national. Um, we also need to make sure that any of that support tackles not just the practical, but the emotional as well, because a lot of couples that are separating aren't actually in the emotional space to engage with each other. And we're trying to sit them down and get them to have practical conversations when they're not in an emotionally ready place to do so. We then talked about the kind of legal changes that we could make in terms of legislative or statutory guidance based movements. Some people have argued that the statutory guidance is robust enough as it is. I believe that we should be going further in terms of a presumption of 50-50 shared care. I think that's really important to give people a base to begin with. And a lot of the Scandinavian countries and some US states have huge success by laying that out at the get-go. But we also need to make sure that our institutions and services are much, much fairer, much, much more operating without prejudice, and are operating quickly and effectively as well to make sure that, sorry if you can hear children in the background. Oh, you can't. Okay, good. That's just for me. Um, they need to make sure that they're operating above all else rapidly, because we're getting a process where if we do have claims that are raised, rightfully, we need to be exploring and investigating those claims. But because those claims take so long to investigate, if those claims end up to be erroneous or false, you've then got a huge amount of time that's been detrimented and kept from a particular parent, which is unacceptable. And the final recommendation is more around societal. It's around the kind of changing the rules of engagement and the rules around separation. We need to be challenging some of those stereotypes around parenting that are really powerful in terms of tiering parents of primary and secondary and natural caregivers and non-natural caregivers, which aren't in line with our understanding around the psychology of attachment, which I think is something that really needs improvement across the systems, is our understanding of the psychology behind separation and parental relationships, but also around challenging rules around engagement for separation itself. And I just tell a quick anecdote that I told in the talk was I was speaking with my hairdresser about doing the TED Talk on Friday. And she said, oh, when I separated with my partner, I made sure not to talk negatively about my ex-husband, even though I hate the guy. And I said, well, good on you, because what you've done is you've protected your child from information that they don't need to have, and that actually end up being more psychologically beneficial for them to not know. So I think we need to really kind of change our attitude towards separation as well, is a big thing. And so that project has fed, I know I'm keeping an eye on my time. That project has fed into broader work around mothers and fathers in the family court, which actually echo a lot of those recommendations, principally around need and demand reduction, which I believe Sir Andrew will probably be touching upon later. Making sure that we're really tackling this from a holistic point of view, and that we're actually tackling issues that potentially arise within intact relationships that lay the foundations for inequality and disparity and acrimony post separation, and really kind of trying to get to the nub and the root of how we can make these systems kind of most effective, most fair, and most just, because we live in a situation where separation and everything around it, I mean, it's essentially a wicked problem in that it's hugely complex. Every case is different, and that there are a lot of factors in play, among many other characteristics of wicked problems, that mean that there isn't going to be an easy kind of solution. But my focus, just because of where I come in my career and my role in the male psychology area and in the British Psychological Society, is that my direct worry is for the thousands and thousands of fathers every single year who are actively suicidal because of this issue. But that does form part of a wider picture. But thank you. That's probably all I have to say. for now.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That was very succinct. We now have 5 minutes for questions. Please just pipe up or raise a yellow hand or a physical hand. Baroness Butler-Sloss.
Well, it was extremely interesting. I'm a former judge. I wondered what your recommendations or your leading recommendation might be as to how to improve.
I think it's difficult to come up with a leading one because I think we must tackle the problem from so many angles at once. I think if I was to pick one, I think my immediate concern would be about providing support at a kind of community level or a package of support that actually fights the issue as it occurs. But it's very hard to kind of prioritize one over the other because we have people that are at all the different stages of the process, all of whom need help and assistance in some way or another. So the recommendations around the family court system itself, in terms of efficacy, in terms of rapidity, in terms of how they deal with domestic violence claims, alienation claims, etc., are probably just as important as going the whole way to the other end of the scale and trying to lay the foundation for preventing the problems arising in the first instance. But if I had to put my pin in one, I would say a national strategy that's government funded for providing support for separating couples. That would be my principle.
Have you looked at the Pathfinder scheme?
Yes, I have, and I have also been tracking that it's preliminarily looking very positive. I know that there's also a tender out for the evaluation of those Pathfinder courts as well. So I'm following that with keen
Because
interest.
I think that is offering support for both parties to a divorce or to a separation. Because in fact, it's not the divorce that matters; it's the separation.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I think Philip is going to weigh in.
Yeah. Philip Marcus, please.
Yeah, I'm a retired family court judge. And as I mentioned at the first session, I'm very grateful to Baroness Butler-Sloss, who received me about 20-something years ago when I was visiting England. And she showed me around a number of the family courts, and I sat with some family judges there. So I'm very grateful to her. There are two things which are connected that I wanted to ask Ben. First is, there's no doubt that this is a public health issue. And the question is whether there's any substantial research as to the costs of the financial cost to the state of family separation and divorce. And I've been trying to put together a research scheme which will look at the costs to mental health, physical health, what happens to the children. They get involved in crime. They get involved in early pregnancies and all that. The question is whether anyone's actually done the figures. We see $51 billion pounds a year cost of divorce. I have no idea what goes into that. So if Ben, you're aware of that, or if anyone who's doing that research, I'd be very interested to hear.
Yeah, so I think I mean, obviously it has a huge cost, and I think what we need to be doing is doing that as a more formal exercise. And I've just put forward a project proposal to a funder that includes an element of that in order to kind of put forward the rationale for focusing on this issue, because we know that the traumas that are inflicted around separation and divorce, and when we talk about that, we're talking about everything from the trauma that is imparted through a relatively amicable separation. There is still a level of trauma that's passed on to children around that process, even if it's done in the absolute right way, it's unavoidable. But then if we look all the way through to the kind of extreme trauma that can be imparted through a very kind of ugly separation process, we know through cycles of violence literature, we know through the literature on attachment theory, etc., we know from all of that that these children will have worse outcomes than those who went through the comparative, maybe amicable separation and whose parents weren't separated. So the evidence, I mean, the conclusion that I keep hearing from lots of conferences on this, and I will presume that a lot of us will come together hopefully on this 13th of June event. We actually know a lot of the answers. It's more about will at this stage, because there are plenty of models that operate elsewhere that show a better way. And again, Sir Andrew's talk is called "There Must Be a Better Way," and I'm sure he'll touch on this. And there is. We know them. They exist. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I think it's more about finding the will rather than the way at the moment, and to great benefit to the coffers, not least to the mental health of those involved, for sure.